Hey everybody, welcome back to Bleak. It's Amanda. Hope everybody's doing well. I want to talk today about Brian Kohberger. I think we should have a break from the Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively. I've been talking a lot about them lately, and I know a lot of people prefer the more traditional true crime stuff. And there has been a little bit of new developments in the case. They had a hearing, I want to say it was last week sometime. So this isn't like hot off the press, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the issues that are being worked out in the Brian Kohberger case as of now, or what's going on with the case as of now, and just some of my thoughts and opinions on what their defense team, or what his defense team is trying to do, and just basically what's going on. So let's get into it. So I'm sure if you're watching this video, you already know about that case. A lot of people refer to it as the Idaho 4 case. I get it, because it's a mouthful to say 4 different victims' names every time, but just out of respect for them, I usually try to at least say their names once in the beginning. So the victims of this case are Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Consalvis, Xana Kernodle, not Xana. I've heard a lot of people call her Xana. Xana like banana. And then Ethan Chapin. Those are the 4 victims. So this case basically happened 2.5 years ago, and it's been slowly making its way through the court system. A lot of people are like, can't believe it hasn't gone to court yet. Unfortunately, just given how slow our system is with especially like a death penalty case, doesn't surprise me at all that it's taken this long. As a matter of fact, there are cases that have taken much longer than 2 or 3 years to get to trial that are, death penalty cases, and very high profile kind of are the 2 main reasons. So this case has gone through a change of venue. So initially the crime happened in Moscow, Idaho, but because of the smaller jury pool, the defense wanted a change of venue, which was granted, and the trial is now going to be held in Ada County, which is Boise, Idaho. If you followed the Daybell Lori Vallow case, it was the same deal. That happened in a smaller town in Idaho called Rexburg, and then it got moved to same county, Ada County, for the same reason. So also when that change of venue happened, it went from Judge John Judge, yes, that was his name, Judge, and he is no longer presiding over the case. I think he was set to retire or something too, because he could have, I guess, continued to preside over the case. So, and apparently he admitted that he didn't want to, which I don't know. But so anyway, so Judge is no longer on the case, and it's Stephen Hippler is the judge, so Judge Hippler. And a lot of people felt like Judge was very pro-defense, and I don't know if I felt that way. I think he granted a lot of the defense's motions, and he also didn't seem like to be in a huge hurry to go to trial. And Judge Hippler does seem a lot more like, this is what we're doing, and we're not going to have like unnecessary setbacks and things like that. So he seems a little bit more on the ball. I think that will be better for this case in general. And he seems very fair, though, as far as I can tell. So anyway, the hearing that was most recently took place in this case was regarding the investigative genetic genealogy, which we'll call it IGG for short, for purposes of the video. And that's what they refer to it in court, because obviously that's a mouthful to say that every single time. So the defense wants the IGG DNA evidence thrown out, which of course would be pretty detrimental to the state's case. I will say a lot of people think that that would make the difference between like them dropping the case and not. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think the CSI effect is very much real, and I think we who consume a lot of, watch different TV shows and consume crime shows and things like that have this expectation that every single case is going to have all these elements, including DNA, including, surveillance videos, cell phone evidence, all these things. And many, many cases do not have DNA evidence, and they have really strong circumstantial evidence, and they are prosecuted, and, juries find that evidence compelling enough. So, I don't know. I think it would really hurt the case and make it much harder, but I don't know that I think it would be impossible without it. But obviously, the prosecution doesn't want to see that thrown out. So, I think with the genetic genealogy, there's a lot of unprecedented territory, because up until this point, IgG has been primarily used for cold cases. So as I'm sure many of you know, one of the first cases that used IgG to solve it was the, what is his name? The guy in California, the Golden State Unaliver. He was active like in the 70s, 80s, and maybe even the early 90s. I'm not sure, but he left DNA at all of his crime scenes, but that was before DNA technology was really, as good as it is now. And they were finally able to solve that with genetic genealogy. And you don't hear about genetic genealogy quite as much in active current cases. And so the issue with that is a lot of times when lawyers are arguing their side in court, they will reference previous case law as a way to kind of back up their argument. And so when they're talking about genetic genealogy, because it's been used pretty infrequently and basically mainly for cold cases, they don't have as much to refer to or as much precedence to be able to say, hey, judge, well, in this case, this judge decided on this, and they cite examples, and then, the judge sees that as compelling because they know that another judge made that decision and it, held up in court, that type of thing. So you don't have that advantage when it's something newer like this. IgG, it's not brand new. It's been out for, I don't know exactly. I would say between 5 and 10 years. But it's gotten a lot more as people have been trained in it with like geneticists and things like that. I think it's gotten a lot more useful, and they're going to be able to use it in more ongoing cases than in the beginning when it was mostly cold cases. But that does present some like new legal challenges that you're seeing in this case that are not some, it's uncharted territory. So the defense's main arguments in this hearing that was had was basically, they argued that the police department violated Brian Kohberger's Fourth Amendment right to privacy because they only got one search warrant for the DNA, and they needed, and I'm not an expert. I don't know if they need a search warrant for the DNA or if because they got the DNA from the crime scene and then they had a search warrant for the crime scene that would cover the DNA. I think it's the latter, but I'm not, I could be wrong on that. But their main argument is, so initially as we all know, the DNA was found on the knife sheath that was halfway underneath Maddie Mogan's body. And according to the PC affidavit, the officer could see the knife sheath. It was like half under her, sticking out from the doorway, like it was just laying on the bed. And so they strongly thought, okay, this is probably, the perpetrator probably did not mean to leave this because, of course, why would you leave that? And they thought, if we can get DNA off of this, it's probably likely to be the perpetrators, which is extremely important in a case like this because these kids lived in a college house that had a lot of parties. And so if they were to start sweeping the house for DNA all over the place, like left and right, that would be extremely problematic. You would have like 100 DNA samples. You wouldn't know which were significant and which weren't. And so I think a lot of people, so one thing I want to bring up, because this is something the defense brought up, is there was a blood stain found on like a banister in the house, and it was such a small little speck of blood that they couldn't even do like regular DNA testing on it. And so they kind of just disregarded it, and especially after they got, Brian Kohberger's name back, and his vehicle and his phone activity and all that matched somebody who could have committed the crime, they didn't really continue to look into other DNA, because why would you? So a lot of people are arguing, online, you hear these theories and they're like, oh, why didn't they test this other DNA? And I've heard a lot of people squawk about that. And the thing about that is, again, if it makes the most sense to test the sheath. Now, the sheath was just a very small amount of skin cells. So I suspect that Brian Kohberger, whom, allegedly, I think he is, my opinion is he is the guy. But Brian Kohberger I bet, cleaned it off before he went inside, or, when he was at home or whatever. And the DNA was found underneath the button snap of the sheath. So a sheath is basically the covering for a knife. It's leather in this case, and it has a little snap to close it. And the snap would have like a little tiny ridge that even if you cleaned it, unless you took like a Q-tip or something and got under there, I would imagine that some of those skin cells could get under there, and that's likely where they were able to pull the sample from. So that to me is very significant, and I can see why the police assumed that it belonged to the perpetrator and not one of the victims. And they would be able to tell they would have all of the victims' DNA profiles to know that this belongs to somebody else and not one of our victims. So they do the testing initially through the CODIS database. So when somebody's arrested for a felony, their DNA is put into CODIS. And that's now a requirement for any felony crime, as far as I know. I think that's in most, if not all, states. And so it stands for like combined DNA index database, something like that. Anyway. And so they did not get a hit on CODIS. So basically that just tells them this person has no felony criminal record. They could have a criminal record, it's just they've never had a felony. And so I think part of the reason why genetic genealogy was used and it done so quickly in this case and compared to other cases is it was such a heinous, violent crime, and the idea of having a perpetrator who was, at that point, they started to suspect was unknown to the victims. I think the police department was really worried about having someone so dangerous out on the streets, which you can imagine, and making sure that this person got caught. And so there is a lab in Texas called Othram, and Othram they have like the most cutting edge of DNA technology in the country, and they can process like tiny DNA samples. And a lot of police departments, across the country will ask them and I'm sure there's like a waiting list, and they have their priorities based on, is this somebody we really need to catch, or I'm sure they have a system and how they organize and decide which is going to be done first. But they were able to process this case, and my understanding is the defense is arguing that, so let me back up. So when you submit your DNA to one of those websites, which I actually myself have done, I used Ancestry. I was just curious as to what I knew. I roughly knew what I was, but I kind of was curious as to like what percentage and things like that. And so when you upload it, or when not upload it, when you send in your DNA, one of the things that they ask you after you get the results back is if you want to be a part of the law enforcement database, which is called GEDmatch, GED match. And basically that is completely voluntary, and you have to sign documents giving express written consent that you're okay with law enforcement comparing your DNA to, unknown samples and using it to solve crime, essentially. And in addition to signing these forms electronically, you also have to transfer your DNA file into a zip file and then upload it to GEDmatch. So the reason I'm telling you all this is because nobody is ending up on GEDmatch without their knowledge, right? Like this idea that I think a lot of people have this perception that the police are just dipping around in everyone's DNA and they can do whatever they want. And I do think that they are able to do more than just GEDmatch, but I do think also they probably only use law enforcement databases for most of their cases. Now, in this particular case, this is just a guess, because what the defense is claiming is every time, so they got their initial search warrant, and then they did CODIS, and there was no hit in CODIS. So then they went to Othram, and they started, I'm assuming they did GEDmatch first, and then they didn't get a hit there, or they didn't find a close enough relative, because some of this is luck-based. If you can find a really close relative in one of those databases to your perpetrator or to your unknown DNA, then you're going to be able to get the identity of the unknown DNA much quicker than if you only find like super distant relatives. Something else that's really interesting that some of you may or may not know is I've heard upwards of 80% of these databases are Caucasian people or white people. And so that's significant here because they are much more likely to be able to find the identity of a white perpetrator. For example, if it's a Native American perpetrator, that population is very much underrepresented on these websites. And so it's more challenging for them to find a perpetrator that's not white. So real quick, I'm just going to go on a little diversion here. There was a case of a woman named Rachel Morin who was jogging, very, very horrible case. She was jogging through like some hiking trails in Maryland, and she was attacked by a stranger, and he victim of a homicide. Sorry, I'm trying not to use certain words because of YouTube. And when this happened, it was such a vicious assault, and they really suspected it was a stranger, and they had DNA in the case, but it took a long time for them to catch the person. And they actually linked his DNA to another unsolved case. It wasn't a homicide. They knew the same person had broken into a house and committed a SA in Los Angeles. So they knew the DNA of these two people was the same, but they didn't know the identity of the person. And he ended up being from El Salvador. And the police actually ended up going to El Salvador to get samples of some of, relatives that they suspected to be more closely related to this unknown perpetrator. So anyhow, you're going to see, I think part of the reason they came to such a quick conclusion with Brian Kohberger had to do with the fact that he was Caucasian and there is such a large representation. But it sounds like they did have to search multiple databases before they were able to get their, deduce back to Brian, or find a close enough relative to Brian and make that family tree connection, which is basically how genetic genealogy works. They build a tree back to the unknown DNA. And they might be able to say, okay, we know it's one of these 3 brothers, for example. But in Kohberger's case, he has 2 sisters, so it wouldn't be that scenario there. But what the defense is basically saying is every time the prosecution or the police department used a different DNA database, that they should have gotten a separate search warrant each time. And because this is, again, it's pretty unprecedented, I don't think that's true personally, and the judge seemed skeptical of it. He made a really good point. He said, well, you know, you're basically, you know, Brian Kohberger doesn't really have a right to private, you know, his privacy interests don't really exist here, because it would be more of an issue if the police were using like a database that they're not, it's more of a gray area. It's not even that they're not supposed to use it. It's that it's just not the one where people are giving this expressed consent. But that would be more of an interest or an issue for the person whose DNA was in that database that the police were looking at than it would be for Brian Kohberger, who left his DNA at a crime scene. And so, you know, if, let's say I somehow found out that my DNA was in, you know, let's say they just used Ancestry's database and not the GEDmatch, because I'm in both, and they said, yeah, we were able, you know, we used your DNA, and you were the closest, you know, relative to Brian Kohberger, and let's say I didn't want the police to have anything to do with my DNA, and I was super upset about the fact that they used it, even if it did catch a really dangerous predator. And so I think the defense is, or the argument is, if the person finds, you know, and I don't know how the person would even necessarily find out about it, which is another reason why I don't think it would be an issue. But if the person, nonetheless, whose DNA that they matched their closest relative to the unknown DNA was really upset about it, then that's something that person would, you know, they maybe would want to sue the police department, or they would want to settle, or they would, whatever, they would want to try to get a new law passed, whatever remedy that they would want to do. That's kind of has really nothing to do with Brian Kohberger and his interests of privacy. And so I don't think that they're going to win in getting this tossed out, but I do think the judge is, you know, taking it seriously, and he's going to, when he rules on this, I think it's going to be, he's going to explain real clearly how he got to the decision that he got to. And another argument the defense made for, you know, for purposes of this hearing was they want to have something called a Franks hearing, which is when they believe that a law enforcement officer obtained a search warrant on false pretenses. And it's basically a hearing where they hear arguments related to what kind of misconduct the defense is alleging that the police were engaged in to get this search warrant. And then they want to get the search warrant thrown out, which would mean anything that was obtained during that search warrant would not be admissible. And so that would be not great for the prosecution either, because my understanding is they did find a lot of pretty interesting things at his home in Pennsylvania and at his apartment in Washington. He has not said for sure that there's going to be a Franks hearing, but I think he is considering it. And we don't know, I think, as of yet, what the exact conduct is that the defense is alleging. And I don't know how common Franks hearings are, or if they usually just deny them, deny the the motion before it even gets to the point of a hearing, or if, I just don't know that because I'm not an attorney. But I do remember from the Delphi case that there was the whole Frank's motion that they put in a bunch of stuff about Odinism, and basically I always say they hijacked the Frank's motion in order to get information out into the public that they wanted into the public that had nothing to do with what a Frank's motion actually is, which to me is a very ethical, not a good ethical line to cross. But anyway, that's me going off on tangents again. So anyway, that's kind of where they left it. So a couple things, or at least one thing that I can think of, that the defense is alleging, so if you remember in that probable cause affidavit, the defense, in the affidavit, it said that Brian Kohberger had gone to the area of the King Road residence on at least 12 prior occasions to the homicides. And of course, Ann Taylor was like, well, that's super misleading because, in the affidavit, it made it sound like he was just sitting there stalking the victims. And in reality, he was, all it means is he passed through that area in some way, shape, or form and connected to the tower that serves the King Road house, and how the affidavit makes it sound much more sinister. And I will say that something I learned is the FCC has only 2 towers listed as being in Moscow, but apparently there are actually 4. And so it's a relatively small town, and there are 4 cell towers. So I think if he's connecting always with the one that provides service to their house, which to my understanding is relatively close to their house, that tower is, it's going to give them some information of like, is he just in the area of the King Road house, or is he just really passing through Moscow for some other, non-nefarious reason? I don't know. They said it was mostly in the overnight hours, so I find that to be a little bit like, why is he, he can't really say, well, I'm just, going to this store I really like, that sells really cool whatever. You can't really say that if the store's not open. So maybe he'll say he's stargazing again. That's what he says the night of the homicides. He's out driving around looking at the stars. I honestly think it's crazy that they even admitted that he was driving around. I think they kind of had to, but still, usually they won't even go that far. So that was something new that the defense is basically trying to say, that it wasn't as much of a stalking as that the affidavit made it sound. And then another thing that they talked about was how the surviving roommate, Dylan, who gave the description of the person she saw in the house, who happened to generally match Kohberger's description, how she made a comment how she didn't know if she was basically seeing things or dreaming. And they're basically saying that it was taken a little bit out of context. But my thing is, the probable cause does not hinge on Dylan's statement, for one thing. And everybody knows she admits to being really intoxicated that night. She maybe was, I could see just being kind of freaked out because you see this guy in your house, you're a little drunk, you hear some weird crying going on, and maybe you're just like, did I just see what I just thought I just saw? Like, there's just some guy with this, COVID type mask on, just kind of randomly walking through my living room. He probably looked like a ninja or something, and I could see her being, just peeking out, seeing that, and kind of being like, thinking she's hallucinating, because it would probably just seemed really bizarre. And so I don't know, I don't see that as being all that damaging, but it was something I had not heard before. So we'll see. It doesn't matter if she says I could have been dreaming or not dreaming. she still gave that description of Kohberger before he was ever even arrested, before he was even on their radar. So I think we all need to keep in mind, this is just my opinion, but there's a lot of conspiracy theories about this case, and some of them are ridiculous. And Dylan, the surviving roommate, and Bethany, the other surviving roommate, they are both victims. When you even remotely imply that they have something to do with these crimes, you are re-victimizing and further victimizing them, and it's not cool. People shouldn't do it. And it's fine if you want to sit and talk about, like, some people have different theories about how they think he started on this floor, the second floor, the third floor, or he had this motive or that motive, but it should all still be based on official legal documents. And if these theories are just coming out of nowhere, that's not really a theory, because it's not based on any evidence or anything known about the case. It's just coming directly from your imagination. So I've heard a lot of stuff online about basically implying that the kids in the house were like all a bunch of drug addicts, and Brian Kohberger, was this drug den, and he was like the girls' pimp. I mean, just crazy stuff like that. I think that there's no proof or evidence that these girls or Ethan were on drugs. Maybe some of them smoked marijuana, which is super common. And even though I don't think it's legal in Idaho, it's, recreationally legal in many states. That doesn't qualify as, like, in my opinion, as, participating in this, dark, illegal drug activity. So anyway, this case, other than just the DNA, you have to remember, they knew that they highly suspected that the perpetrator's vehicle was a white Hyundai Elantra. They were a little off on the year, but I actually had a 2013 red Hyundai Elantra. And let me tell you, like, from year to year, there was a solid book of years, probably from 2012 to maybe 2016, where I would see other people with the vehicle and I thought it would be the same year as mine, and I would see someone else's vehicle look identical, and I'd ask them what year it was, and it would be a different year out of they would say, oh, mine's a 2015, and I'd be like, oh, mine's a 2013, but it looks identical. So a lot of people make a big deal about the fact that the FBI had thought it was, like a 2012 through a 2014, and it ended up being like a 16, something like that. I don't think that that's very significant, but he did, so he happens to drive the same make, model, color of vehicle that they are seeing on surveillance going to and from the crime scene. He happens to be lacking a front license plate. Now, this is I think this is significant. It's an identifying feature of the vehicle. In Pennsylvania, where Kohberger is from, they do not require front license plates, and they do in Washington and in Idaho. So it would make sense he would come there without the front plates because it's not required in Pennsylvania. He actually got a front plate put on after the homicides in the last week of November. Now, his tabs were due to expire, so that would make sense why he would get new plates at the same time. So that could have been coincidental, but he also probably, would have wanted to get that front license plate on there so that it wouldn't be matching this kind of distinct feature. Because a lot of people are like, well, that doesn't mean anything. But, I've been, ever since this case, because I live in Minnesota and we require a front license plate, I've been looking around trying to find one vehicle driving around without a front license plate. And it's just to prove that, like, it's not that common of a thing for people to just not, if it's required in their state, they don't want to get pulled over all the time and not be, doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I don't think it's that common for people to drive around without front plates if it's required in your state. So I personally find that compelling, that there's no front plate. I know they couldn't actually see the license in the back, and who knows, maybe he had it somewhat obstructed or something, but that lacking of a front plate is something that would be specific to Kohberger's vehicle that is compelling. He also, his cell phone evidence is extremely suspicious. The fact that he has his phone on as he's leaving his residence going towards Moscow, the phone goes dark, likely he just turned it off, and then it's off during, for the next couple hours during the homicides, and then it comes back on as he's heading away from the homicide scene. And so his phone activities are really suspicious. I'm sure they'll be able to go back in his historical records and say, look, does he ever just turn off his phone randomly for 2 hours in the middle of the night? I'm going to bet that he probably doesn't. So that's, sometimes the turning off of the phone can be just as compelling as having, phone records that he's right by the house at the time of the homicides. It just depends on how you look at it. And then there's a lot of other circumstantial evidence just based on his behavior, his attitude towards women, the fact that I think he's 29 now, but as of age 27, he hadn't ever had a real romantic relationship with a female. I think he was angry. He felt slighted. I think that the people that lived at the King Road house were represented something that he really just felt like he couldn't have, and he was extremely envious of them. I don't know how he crossed paths with them, if he stumbled upon the house itself and, started watching them and from afar and became jealous of their social situation compared to his. But I think the psychological piece really makes a lot of sense, that someone like Kohberger would have done something like this, just with that built up anger and rage that's boiling over eventually over time. And my theory of the crime is, in case anyone's curious, maybe you don't care. If you didn't care, you probably would have turned this off by now, but I believe there's a few things I think we can glean from the PCA. I think we can glean that Maddie was likely, her life was likely taken first. The knife sheath was found halfway under her body on the side of the bed. It makes sense he takes off the sheath to commence the attack and kind of loses that in the shuffle. I don't think he thought that there was going to be someone else there. Kaylee had just gotten a brand new Range Rover, so he maybe didn't make the connection that she was there, if he was familiar with her at all, from even if he had stalked the house or not, or even maybe online looked, it's hard to say, but I don't think he necessarily knew she had gotten a new vehicle. So wasn't expecting Kaylee, and then ends up, you have to understand too, he ambushed them in their sleep. So if they're sleeping, by the time Kaylee was fully probably up and awake, and I know I'm sorry to be graphic, but if he went for, through their throat, it would be difficult to scream. And again, if you're ambushed in your sleep, that's much, much different than, if, you're fully awake and somebody attacks you. And so I think people, who are saying, oh, how could he do that in 15 or 17 minutes? Go sit on your couch and run a timer for 17 minutes. It's actually a really long time. It's plenty of time to do what he did, especially if he was methodical and about the way he did it. I think he was going to leave, and as he's leaving, we know that Xana got a DoorDash order at 4 a.m. and so that would have been right before Kohberger arrived at the house. I think Xana's up eating her DoorDash. She runs into him maybe in the kitchen or somewhere outside of her bedroom. He says to her, it's okay, I'm here to help you, to try to keep her calm. Maybe says something like, if you scream, I'm going to hurt you, so just don't scream. he, of course, doesn't keep his word and ends up attacking her anyway. I think Xana was trying to make her way towards the bedroom to get help from Ethan, and that's why she's eventually found on the floor. And then there's this loud thud heard on a surveillance camera 50 feet from Xana's bedroom window. I want to say it was 417 that thud is heard, and I think that was her hitting the floor. And then I think Ethan probably was asleep, and that's why he decided to kind of attack Ethan when he wasn't in a state to really defend himself very well. If, you know, he was maybe half awake, or you know, or they could have really gotten into it, but it doesn't really seem that way based on what we know so far. So anyway, that's just my general theory of the case. And then I think as he's walking out to leave, that's when Dylan had opened her door and sees him walking past. And yeah, then he also returned to the crime scene the next morning, which his phone pinged off that tower the next morning around 9 something in the morning. That to me is really compelling, of something that a sociopath would do to try to kind of see what's going on at the crime scene. I bet you he was really confused too when he got back there, and he's like, what is going on? Like, he probably expected this huge police presence. So anyhow, that's all I have for today. Let me know if you guys want me to keep talking about new Kohberger updates. I won't get into like my theories and stuff every single time like I just did now, but yeah. Anyway, have a great day. I gotta go get my son from school. Talk to you later.